74,000 years ago, the sky turned black. Not for hours, not for days, for years. Ash fell across continents like snow that never melted, piling meters deep, burying everything. The sun became a memory. Temperatures collapsed. And somewhere in that darkness, scattered across Africa and southern Asia, our numbers plummeted. Some estimates say only 1,000 of us remained alive. Most of them would not survive the decade. Their children would not remember what the world looked like before. And if you are watching this now, you are descended from the few who made it through. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because extinction failed to finish what it started. This is not a story about human triumph. This is a story about how close we came to never existing at all. The mountain had been smoking for weeks. In northern Sumatra, 74,000 years ago, something enormous stirred beneath the Earth's crust. Magma chambers the size of mountain ranges swelled with pressure that had been building for hundreds of thousands of years. The ground trembled. Animals fled. And then, one morning, the planet cracked open. What emerged was not an eruption. It was a planetary wound. The Toba supervolcano exploded with a force that defies meaningful comparison. Modern volcanoes, Krakatoa, Mount St. Helens, Pinatubo, are footnotes compared to Toba. This was an event 800 times more powerful than the eruption that buried Pompeii. It ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and debris into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, if you could gather all the material from Toba's eruption and drop it on the continental United States, it would bury the entire country under nearly a meter of volcanic ash. The initial blast created a caldera 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, a scar in the earth so vast it would later fill with water to become Lake Toba, one of the largest volcanic lakes in the world. But the crater was the least of the problem. The real catastrophe was what went into the sky. Within hours, a column of superheated gas, ash, and pulverized rock climbed 50 kilometers into the stratosphere. The eruption column was so massive, so energetic, that it punched through the troposphere entirely and injected volcanic material directly into the upper atmosphere where it could circle the globe. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of gas and rock heated to 700 degrees Celsius, raced across Sumatra at hundreds of kilometers per hour, incinerating everything for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. But the flows only killed locally. What went into the atmosphere killed globally. Volcanic ash is not like the ash from a campfire. It is pulverized rock, tiny shards of glass, and mineral fragments so fine they remain suspended in the air for months, even years. Toba ejected so much ash that within weeks, it formed a veil around the entire planet. Sunlight, which had bathed the Earth for billions of years, suddenly couldn't penetrate. The world dimmed, then it darkened. Then, for all practical purposes, the sun disappeared. Photosynthesis slowed, then stopped in many regions. Plants that relied on consistent sunlight began to die. Grasslands withered, forests thinned, and with the plants went everything that depended on them. Temperatures collapsed. The volcanic winter that followed Toba's eruption was not a temporary cold snap. Current estimates suggest global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius on average, with some regions experiencing drops of 10 degrees or more. In tropical Africa, where early humans had evolved in relatively stable, warm climates, temperatures plummeted. In already cold regions, glaciers advanced. Ice sheets thickened, snowfall became relentless. This was not weather, this was climate collapse. For early human populations scattered across Africa and southern Asia, the change was incomprehensible. These were people who understood seasonal variation, who tracked animal migrations, who knew which plants fruited when. But this was different. The rains didn't come, the plants didn't grow, the animals didn't return, and the sky, always the sky, remained gray, ashen, lifeless. In India, ash fell for months. Layers of Toba ash discovered in the region measure up to 6 meters deep in some areas. 6 meters. Imagine standing in a layer of ash twice as tall as you are, knowing it fell from the sky, knowing there is no end to it. The Ganges Plain, one of the most fertile regions on Earth, became a desert of volcanic dust. Any humans living there faced a choice that was no choice at all: move or die. Most chose to move. most died anyway. Africa, the cradle of humanity, did not escape. While the ash fall was lighter than in Asia, the climatic effects were devastating. East Africa dried out. Water sources shrank or vanished. The great herds that early humans hunted dwindled. Droughts extended not for seasons, but for years. The few humans who remained clustered around shrinking lakes, rivers that became streams, streams that became mud. Starvation was not quick. It was slow, generational, relentless. Women became malnourished and stopped ovulating. Infants died in the womb or shortly after birth. Children who survived infancy faced stunted growth, cognitive impairment, weakened immune systems. The older generation, already struggling, died first, taking with them irreplaceable knowledge about how to find water in dry seasons, which plants were safe to eat, how to make specific tools. And everywhere there was silence. One of the most disturbing aspects of post-Toba ecosystems was not what remained, but what vanished. Bird populations collapsed as insect populations died off. Mammal herds thinned to near extinction. Predators, starved of prey, turned on each other or simply died. The soundscape of the world changed. Where once there had been birdsong, insect hum, the rustling of large animals through brush, there was now only wind moving through empty spaces. Humans are social creatures. We evolved in groups, surrounded by sound, by voices, by the constant background noise of a living world. The silence after Toba was pathological. It meant death. It meant emptiness. For the survivors, the world had become a graveyard that stretched in every direction. Small groups, isolated by distance and dying ecosystems, faced impossible mathematics. A group of 50 people cannot sustain itself genetically for more than a few generations. Inbreeding depression, the accumulation of harmful genetic mutations, sets in quickly. Children are born with defects. Immune systems weaken. Fertility drops. Without contact with other groups, without genetic exchange, a population of 50 is already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. And contact had become nearly impossible. Before Toba, human populations across Africa and southern Asia likely numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possibly more. They were dispersed, yes, but connected through trade, migration, occasional interbreeding. Stone tools found in East Africa show design influences from populations hundreds of kilometers away. Genetic evidence suggests regular gene flow between distant groups. Humanity was not unified, but it was networked. Toba severed those networks. Travel became lethal. The distances between surviving groups stretched from difficult to insurmountable. A group that might have migrated 200 kilometers in search of better hunting grounds now faced landscapes stripped bare, water sources poisoned with ash, and cold that killed the unprepared. Even if you knew another group existed 300 kilometers away, getting there was a death sentence. So, groups stayed where they were, and died where they were. The fossil record from this period is haunting in its emptiness. Archaeologists find evidence of human habitation, then nothing. Sites that show continuous occupation for thousands of years simply go silent after Toba. There are no signs of violence, no mass graves, no indication of plague. There is just absence. The people who lived there stopped living there. And most of them stopped living anywhere. By the time the ash settled and the skies began to clear, a process that took between 6 and 10 years, the damage was done. Ecosystems had collapsed, megafauna populations had crashed, and humanity, which had once been a widespread species with a promising future, had been reduced to scattered remnants clinging to survival in isolated pockets across 2 continents. The eruption was over, but the extinction was just beginning, because what Toba started, the decades that followed would nearly complete. There is a ghost in your DNA, a moment of silence written into every cell in your body. It appears in the genetic record as a bottleneck, a sudden dramatic reduction in genetic diversity that happened roughly 70,000 years ago. When scientists compare the genetic variation between modern humans and our closest relatives, chimpanzees, something disturbing emerges. 2 chimpanzees from different regions of Africa can be more genetically diverse from each other than any 2 humans anywhere on Earth. A chimp in West Africa and a chimp in East Africa will show greater genetic variation than a human in Norway and a human in New Zealand, We are all, genetically speaking, nearly identical, and that kind of similarity only happens one way, through an extreme population bottleneck, through near extinction. The numbers are difficult to pin down precisely, but the genetic evidence is unmistakable. At some point in the last 100,000 years, human populations collapsed to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. For context, there are currently more than 7,000 northern white rhinoceros that ever existed at their lowest population point, and we consider them functionally extinct. Humanity, for a period of time, was more endangered than the most critically endangered species on Earth today. Some estimates push even lower. Some models suggest the breeding population may have dropped below 3,000 individuals. If that's accurate, then everyone alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from a founding population that could have fit inside a modern sports stadium with room to spare. Think about that. Every person you have ever met, every historical figure, every culture, language, achievement, and failure in recorded history traces back to a group of humans so small they could have gathered in one place and still not filled it. The bottleneck was not uniform. Different populations were hit differently. Some groups vanished entirely, their genetic lineages erased from existence. Others survived but lost so many members that their genetic diversity collapsed. And a very few, maintained slightly larger populations, though even these were catastrophically reduced. Africa, the homeland of humanity, saw populations fragment into isolated pockets. Genetic studies of modern African populations show signs of separation during this period, with groups becoming isolated from each other for thousands of years. These were not tribes choosing to live separately. These were survivors trapped by geography and dying ecosystems, unable to reach each other even if they wanted to. In southern Africa, one group found refuge along the coast. The archaeological record shows human occupation in coastal caves, subsisting on shellfish, seal meat, and whatever plant material they could gather. The ocean became their lifeline. While inland ecosystems collapsed, the sea remained relatively stable. Shellfish don't care if the sun is blocked. Tides don't stop because ash is falling. For the humans who reached the coast and learned to exploit marine resources, survival became possible. Difficult, but possible. But coastal adaptation required knowledge, tools, and a willingness to eat things their ancestors never ate. It required innovation under pressure, and not every group could manage it. In East Africa, around what is now Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika, other groups survived near freshwater sources. These lakes, some of the deepest in the world, maintained ecosystems even when surrounding areas turned to dust. Fish populations persisted, water birds remained, and the humans who stayed near these lakes managed to endure, but they were trapped. Leaving the lake meant entering dead zones where nothing grew and nothing lived. So they stayed. For generations. For millennia. Outside Africa, the situation was even worse. The few human populations that had migrated into southern Asia before Toba faced complete annihilation. Ash fall in India, and Southeast Asia was orders of magnitude worse than in Africa. Any humans living in these regions at the time of the eruption faced immediate environmental collapse, followed by prolonged volcanic winter. Most did not survive. There is ongoing debate among archaeologists about whether any human populations outside Africa survived Toba at all. Some evidence suggests small refugia, isolated areas where conditions remained marginally survivable, may have harbored tiny groups, but even if they survived the initial eruption, the genetic evidence suggests they did not contribute significantly to later human populations. They were dead ends. Lineages that survived for a few generations, maybe a few centuries, before finally blinking out. The real survival happened in Africa. And even there, it was not pretty. Imagine being part of a group of 30 people. You have known everyone your entire life. Your mother, your siblings, your cousins. The older members of the group remember when there were more of you, when other groups would visit, when there were gatherings with dozens of people. But those days are gone. The other groups stopped coming. You don't know if they moved away or died. You suspect they died. Your group is hungry, always hungry. The hunting is poor. The plants that used to grow everywhere now only appear in scattered patches. The animals are wary, scarce. Every few months someone dies. Old injuries that would have healed before now become infected. Fevers that should pass linger and kill. Women give birth less frequently, and when they do, the infants often don't survive. You know your group is dying. You can see it in the numbers. There used to be children everywhere. Now, there are only a few. The older generation is almost gone. And you, the young adults who should be having children, building the next generation, are barely surviving yourselves. You have never seen another human group in your entire life. You have heard stories about them, about the gatherings, the trade, the marriages between groups. But they are stories, myths. The world you live in contains only your 30 people, and each year there are fewer. This was the reality for countless human groups in the millennia following Toba. Isolation was not a choice. It was a death sentence being carried out slowly. Genetic diversity is not an abstract concept. It is survival insurance. It means that when a new disease appears, some people will have genetic resistance. It means that when food sources change, some people will be able to adapt. It means that when the environment shifts, the population has enough variation that some lineages will make it through. But when diversity collapses, that insurance disappears. A population becomes brittle, vulnerable. A single pathogen can wipe out everyone because nobody has resistance. A drought that would have killed 10% of a diverse population kills 50% of a bottlenecked one. And there is no way to recover that diversity quickly. It takes tens of thousands of years of population growth and mixing to rebuild what was lost. Cultural knowledge collapsed along with populations. Humans are unique among animals in our ability to transmit complex information across generations. We teach our children how to make tools, where to find food, how to interpret the environment. But that knowledge is fragile. It exists in people's minds, passed through demonstration and practice. When those people die before they can teach the next generation, the knowledge dies with them. After Toba, entire technological traditions vanished. Stone tool types that had been manufactured for thousands of years simply disappeared from the archaeological record. Not because people forgot how to make tools, but because they forgot how to make specific types of tools. The detailed knowledge of how to create a perfectly symmetrical hand axe, how to heat treat stone to improve flaking quality, how to haft a blade onto a spear, these skills require teachers and practice. When populations crash, specialized knowledge is the first thing to go. What remained was the basics: how to make a sharp edge, how to start a fire, how to find water. The fundamental skills that meant the difference between life and death. Everything else, art, ceremony, complex tool-making, elaborate social structures, became luxuries that dying populations could not afford. There is evidence of technological regression in the archaeological record. Sites post-Toba show simpler tools, cruder workmanship, less diversity in artifact types. This is not because the survivors were less intelligent. It's because they were fewer, more isolated, and fighting for survival. When you're starving, you don't have time to perfect your craftsmanship. You make what works quickly and move on. The psychological cost of near extinction is something we can only speculate about. But the speculation is grim. Humans are wired for social connection. We experience isolation as physical pain. The prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for complex thought, begins to malfunction under prolonged isolation. Depression, anxiety, paranoia, these are not modern inventions. They are ancient responses to environmental and social stress. For the survivors of Toba, living in tiny, isolated groups, watching their numbers dwindle year after year, the psychological burden must have been immense. Did they experience something like collective despair? Did they understand that they were dying out? Or did each generation simply accept their diminished world as normal, unaware that things had ever been different? We know from modern studies of isolated populations that small group size creates intense social pressure. Everyone knows everyone. Every conflict matters. There is no escape, no privacy, no ability to leave and join another group. Tensions that would be minor in a large population become critical in a small one, and when resources are scarce, those tensions become deadly. Anthropological studies of small hunter-gatherer groups show that violence increases when populations are stressed. When food becomes scarce, when the group becomes too small to be viable, people make desperate choices. Infanticide increases. Elderly members are abandoned. Weak individuals are ostracized or killed. These are not signs of moral failure. They are signs of populations at the edge of viability, making brutal calculations about who gets to survive. The Toba survivors likely face these same calculations. When there is only enough food for 20 people and you have 25, someone has to die. And the group chooses the infant born with a defect, the elder who can no longer keep up, the injured hunter who will never recover. These are not hypotheticals. These are the mathematics of extinction. And most groups failed the math. The majority of human lineages that existed before Toba do not exist today. They are gone, erased. Their unique genetic combinations, their cultural knowledge, their languages, their stories, all vanished. What we see today in the genetic record of modern humans is not the full spectrum of human diversity that once existed. It is the narrow remnant, the few lineages that happened to survive. There was no superiority in that survival, no special adaptation, no evolutionary advantage that made the survivors better than those who died. The difference between extinction and survival came down to geography, luck, and the random chance of who happened to be in the right place when the world ended. A group that lived 50 kilometers from a reliable water source survived. A group that lived 60 kilometers away did not. That was the margin. That was the difference between existing and not existing. And if you trace your ancestry back far enough, you will find that your existence depends on that kind of blind chance happening correctly dozens of times over thousands of years. Most versions of humanity died. The ones that survived were not the best versions. They were simply the versions that didn't die fast enough. Recovery from near extinction is not a story of triumph. It is a story of decades becoming centuries, centuries becoming millennia, and the slow, grinding process of rebuilding from almost nothing. The ash eventually stopped falling. The skies cleared. Temperatures began to rise. But the world that emerged from Toba's shadow was not the world that existed before. Ecosystems were restructured. Megafauna populations had crashed and would never fully recover. Forests were thinner, grasslands were sparser, and the few thousand humans scattered across Africa and southern Asia faced a long, uncertain climb back from the edge of extinction. Genetic evidence suggests that for thousands of years after Toba, human populations remained small and isolated. There was no sudden rebound, no population explosion, just slow, incremental growth limited by resources, by isolation, and by the genetic bottleneck itself. When a population loses genetic diversity, it loses the raw material for adaptation. Evolution slows. The ability to respond to new challenges decreases, and recovery takes exponentially longer. For the coastal populations in southern Africa, survival meant commitment to a marine lifestyle that was radically different from their ancestors. They became specialists in a way earlier humans had not been. Shell middens from this period show intensive exploitation of coastal resources: mussels, limpets, abalone, seal meat. These people were not just visiting the coast, they were living there permanently, developing technologies specifically for marine environments. Some of the earliest known fishing hooks and line weights appear in southern African sites dating to this period. These are not crude experiments. They are refined tools made by people who understood the ocean and how to extract food from it. But specialization is a double-edged sword. It means survival in one environment. It also means vulnerability if that environment changes, or if the population needs to move. The groups that survived near the Great Lakes of East Africa developed their own adaptations. They became experts at fishing in deep water, at exploiting seasonal bird migrations, at finding plant resources in marginal environments. Archaeological evidence shows increasing sophistication in fishing technology. Harpoons, fish traps, nets woven from plant fibers. These were not innovations born from leisure. They were innovations born from necessity, from the absolute requirement to extract more calories from the environment than the previous generation did, or die. But isolation remained the defining characteristic of this period. Even as populations slowly grew, groups remained separated by vast distances and inhospitable terrain. The networks that had once connected human populations across Africa were gone. Each group survived on its own, developing its own solutions, its own technologies, its own cultural practices. This is why, when geneticists study modern human populations, they can still see the signatures of these isolated lineages. Different African populations show genetic patterns consistent with thousands of years of separation following the bottleneck. Groups that today live relatively close to each other genetically reflect populations that were isolated for 10, 20, even 30,000 years after Toba before contact resumed. Outside Africa, the story was even more complicated. The question of whether any human populations survived Toba in Asia remains contentious. Some archaeological sites in India show continuous occupation through the Toba period. Others show a complete break, with human habitation disappearing for thousands of years before slowly reappearing. The most likely scenario is that some small groups survived in isolated refugia, but their numbers were so reduced that they contributed minimally to later populations. The real recolonization of Asia happened later, much later, when African populations had recovered enough to begin expanding out of the continent again. This wasn't a planned migration. It was the gradual diffusion of growing populations into adjacent territories. Groups would split when they grew too large. Some would stay. Others would move into new areas. Generation by generation, human populations crept outward from their African refugia, but this expansion was slow, painfully slow. Genetic dating suggests that the major expansion of humans out of Africa and into Asia and Europe happened between 60 and 70,000 years ago, thousands of years after Toba, which means that for millennia, humanity was essentially trapped in Africa, rebuilding, recovering, surviving, but not expanding. This is not the narrative we usually tell ourselves about human history. We like stories of bold migrations, of adventurous pioneers pushing into new frontiers. But the reality after Toba was different. The reality was populations too small and too fragile to risk expansion, groups clinging to the few areas where survival was possible, unable to move, unable to grow quickly, just enduring. The psychological and cultural impacts of this period are impossible to measure directly, but we can infer them. When populations remain small for thousands of years, certain cultural practices emerge, strict taboos about resources, detailed knowledge of every food source in the territory, complicated kinship rules designed to prevent inbreeding. These are not arbitrary cultural choices. They are survival mechanisms encoded into tradition. Modern hunter-gatherer societies that live in marginal environments show these patterns. Sand populations in southern Africa have intricate knowledge systems about water sources, plant cycles, and animal behavior that take decades to learn. Aboriginal Australian societies developed kinship systems so complex that they ensured genetic mixing even when populations were dispersed over vast areas. These are not primitive systems. They are sophisticated solutions to the problem of surviving in small numbers over long periods. The Toba survivors almost certainly developed similar systems. They had to. Without them, inbreeding would have collapsed their populations within generations. Without detailed environmental knowledge, they would have starved. Without strict social rules governing behavior and resource use, conflicts would have torn the groups apart. But these systems, however sophisticated, could not restore what was lost. They could not bring back the genetic diversity that disappeared. They could not resurrect the extinct lineages. They could not recover the cultural knowledge that died with entire populations. What survived was a subset, a fragment, a narrow slice of human potential that happened to make it through. Modern humans, all of us, descend from that fragment. Our genetic similarity is not a sign of human unity. It's a scar, evidence of the extinction that almost happened. When you look at another human being, anywhere on Earth, you are looking at someone who shares a recent common ancestor with you. Not because humans are naturally unified, but because everyone who doesn't share that recent common ancestor is dead. Their lineages ended. Only ours continued. This is disturbing when you really consider it. Every person alive today is part of a single, successful lineage. But there is no reason to believe that lineage was special. No evidence that the survivors were superior. The people who died in the Toba aftermath were not inferior humans. They were not less intelligent, less adaptable, less worthy of survival. They were simply in the wrong place. Or the right place at the wrong time. Or separated from resources by distances they couldn't cross. Or unlucky. Survival was random, and if it had randomized differently, if the groups that survived had been different groups, humanity would still have survived. But it would have been a different humanity, with different genes, different cultures, different trajectories. The humans that exist today are not inevitable. We are contingent, accidental. We exist because extinction failed to complete its work. Not because we earned existence, not because we were destined for it, but because the die rolled in our favor. Barely. Just enough times for us to persist. The expansion out of Africa, when it finally happened, was not a conquest. It was a dispersal. Small groups moving into new territories, facing new challenges, adapting or dying. Many groups died. The archaeological record shows repeated colonization attempts that failed. Sites occupied for a few generations, then abandoned. Populations that expanded into Europe during warm periods only to be wiped out when ice ages returned. Even successful expansions were tenuous. The humans who reached Europe 60,000 years ago would be completely replaced by later waves of migration. The humans who crossed into Asia diversified into populations that would later encounter each other as strangers. The humans who eventually reached the Americas did so by threading through frozen landscapes where one wrong turn meant death. None of this was inevitable. All of it was precarious. And at every step, the shadow of Toba lingered. Human populations remained smaller, more vulnerable, more at risk than they had been before the eruption. It would take tens of thousands of years for humanity to recover the genetic diversity and population size that existed before Toba. And in some ways, we never fully recovered. The bottleneck signature remains in our DNA, visible even now. One of the most haunting aspects of the post-Toba recovery is how long it took. From the initial eruption to the point where human populations were widespread, numerous, and relatively secure took roughly 40,000 years. 40,000 years. That is longer than all of recorded human history. Longer than agriculture, longer than cities, longer than writing. For a period of time, longer than we have been building civilizations, humanity was recovering from near extinction. And during that entire period, at any point, it could have failed. A particularly harsh ice age, a disease, a few bad decisions by a few key groups. Any of these could have pushed the recovery into reverse, could have turned the slow climb back into a final slide toward extinction. It almost happened, multiple times. The genetic evidence shows additional smaller bottlenecks within the larger post-Toba recovery. Population crashes that hit specific lineages. Groups that expanded, then nearly vanished, then barely recovered. Each one a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. We carry that fragility with us still. The genetic bottleneck that Toba created left us with less disease resistance than we would have had otherwise. Less genetic variation in immune response, less diversity in everything from metabolism to neurological function. In a very real sense, Toba made humanity more vulnerable. And we remain that way today. Modern humans are genetically similar enough that an epidemic disease with the right characteristics could potentially affect all populations. We don't have the diversity of resistance that a pre-Toba human population might have had. We are, in some ways, still living in the shadow of that near-extinction event 74,000 years ago. The survivors were not chosen. They were not special. They were simply the ones who didn't die quickly enough. And we are their descendants, carrying forward a genetic legacy shaped by catastrophe and random chance. If you could go back and meet those survivors, you would not find superior humans. You would find starving, desperate people clinging to survival in a world that had turned hostile. You would find populations isolated for so long they had forgotten other humans existed. You would find knowledge being lost, technologies being simplified, entire cultural traditions vanishing because there was nobody left to remember them. You would find humans at the absolute edge of viability, and you would understand, viscerally, that your existence depends on those people not giving up. Not because they were heroic, not because they had something to fight for, but because the alternative to continuing was dying immediately instead of dying slowly. And dying slowly at least offered the chance, however remote, that tomorrow might be different. Most tomorrows were not different. But enough of them were. Just barely enough. The story we tell ourselves about human history is a story of progress. From primitive beginnings to technological mastery, from scattered tribes to global civilization, from ignorance to knowledge, it is a comfortable narrative, an empowering one. It suggests that we are here because we earned it, because humanity has something special that carried us forward through every challenge. the truth is more disturbing. We are here because 74,000 years ago, extinction started its work and failed to finish. We are here because a few thousand people happened to be in the right places when the world went dark. We are here because random chance rolled in our favor, just enough times that the lineage didn't break. There is no evidence that the humans who survived Toba were superior to those who died. No genetic markers for survival ability, no special intelligence or adaptability that distinguish the ancestors of modern humans from the extinct lineages. The difference was geography, luck, the blind chance of who happened to be near a water source, near the coast, in a refugium where survival remained just barely possible. And if that's true, if survival was that contingent, that accidental, then we need to reconsider what human survival means going forward, because the assumption underlying modern civilization is that humanity is robust, that we are adaptable enough, smart enough, resilient enough to survive anything, that our technology and our numbers make us invulnerable. That extinction is something that happens to other species, not to us. But Toba says otherwise. Toba says that a single volcanic eruption reduced us to near extinction, not over millions of years, over decades. One geological event, and humanity went from widespread to endangered. And we survived not through superiority, but through chance. Through the accident of some groups being in places where survival was marginally possible. What happens when chance rolls against us? What happens when the refugia don't exist? What happens when the catastrophe is not localized but global, not temporary but sustained? Climate models for the coming century predict temperature increases that will render large portions of the Earth uninhabitable, not uncomfortable. Uninhabitable. Wet bulb temperatures that exceed human physiological limits. Regions where you cannot survive outside without artificial cooling. And those regions will not be small. They will encompass areas currently home to billions of people. Where are the refugia in that scenario? Where are the coastal populations that can adapt? Where are the isolated lakes that maintain ecosystems while everything else collapses? And more importantly, how do 7 billion people fit into whatever refugia exist? The answer is, they don't. They can't. If a Toba-scale catastrophe happened today, we would not survive the way our ancestors survived. We are too numerous, too dependent on complex systems, too specialized. When hunter-gatherer populations collapsed, the survivors could live off the land, could hunt and gather, could survive in small groups. When modern populations collapse, we have no such fallback. We depend on agriculture, on supply chains, on infrastructure that requires millions of people to maintain. Take away the infrastructure, and most of us die in months. Take away agriculture, and we die in weeks. We have engineered ourselves into a corner where our survival depends on systems that are themselves fragile. The Toba survivors could scatter. Modern humans cannot. We are tethered to our cities, our farms, our power grids. And if those fail, we fail with them. There is an assumption that technology will save us, that we can engineer solutions to any problem, that our intelligence and our tools make us fundamentally different from the humans who nearly went extinct 74,000 years ago. But that assumption may be wrong. Intelligence didn't save the pre-Toba populations who died. They were just as smart as the survivors. They had the same tools, the same capabilities. What they didn't have was luck. They didn't have the right geography. And intelligence cannot overcome geography when the environment itself becomes lethal. Our technology is impressive, but it is not robust against systemic collapse. It is optimized for stability, not catastrophe. When systems fail, technology becomes useless. A smartphone with no power grid is a brick. An electric car with no charging infrastructure is immobile. A modern hospital with no supply chain is a tomb. We have not become invulnerable. We have become dependent. And dependence is the opposite of resilience. The genetic bottleneck from Toba still affects us. Our immune systems carry the signature of reduced diversity. We are more vulnerable to pandemics than a genetically diverse population would be. And pandemics are not hypothetical threats. They have happened. They will happen again. And next time, we may not be lucky, because that's what survival comes down to. Not skill, not preparation, luck. The luck of the pandemic not being quite deadly enough. The luck of the volcanic eruption happening in a remote location instead of near a population center. The luck of climate change happening slowly enough that we can adapt, maybe, if everything goes right. But what if everything doesn't go right? What if luck runs out? The Toba survivors did not know they were the last humans. They had no concept of extinction, no understanding that their species was on the edge. They simply lived day by day, trying to survive. And most of them failed. Most groups died out. Only a few persisted long enough to become ancestors. We have the advantage of knowing what happened, of understanding that extinction is possible, that it nearly happened once, that there is no guarantee it won't happen again. But knowledge is not prevention. Knowing about the risk does not eliminate the risk. And if anything, our knowledge makes the situation more disturbing because we know what we're risking and we're not doing enough to prevent it. Current extinction rates for other species are accelerating, not because those species are inferior, but because we are destroying the environments they depend on. And in destroying those environments, we are making our own environment less stable, less resilient, less capable of supporting us when catastrophe comes. And catastrophe will come. The question is not if, but when. Yellowstone is a supervolcano. It sits beneath Wyoming, a magma chamber the size of a small country, building pressure. It has erupted before. It will erupt again. When it does, the United States will become largely uninhabitable. North America will experience immediate ash fall measured in meters. Global temperatures will drop. Agriculture across the northern hemisphere will fail. And we will discover very quickly whether modern civilization can survive what our ancestors barely survived with stone tools and hunting skills. The odds are not good. Consider the mathematics. 74,000 years ago, human populations crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals. They survived because they were dispersed, mobile, and capable of living off the land with minimal technology. Today, we number 8 billion. We are concentrated in cities. We depend on global supply chains for food. We require electricity, fuel, medicine, clean water, delivered through infrastructure. And we have lost the knowledge our ancestors had about survival without technology. If a Toba-scale eruption happened tomorrow, how many of us would survive the first year, the first month, the first week? Most urban populations would collapse within days. Cities are consumption centers, not production centers. They import everything: food, water, energy. Cut the supply lines and cities become death traps. Millions of people packed into spaces with no food production, no clean water, no way to heat or cool buildings, and no way to leave because everyone else is trying to leave simultaneously. The wealthy would flee to bunkers, to rural retreats, to places they believe are safe. But wealth does not create resilience. It creates isolation. And isolated groups, as the Toba survivors learned, die out. You cannot maintain genetic diversity with 50 people in a bunker. You cannot rebuild civilization with a handful of billionaires and their security teams. You can survive for a while, maybe decades, but eventually inbreeding, resource depletion, or simple bad luck catches up. The rural populations would fare better. Initially, those with farming skills, with land, with knowledge of how to grow food without industrial agriculture. But modern farming depends on fuel, on machinery, on supply chains for seeds and fertilizers. Take those away, and crop yields collapse. Even experienced farmers would struggle to feed themselves, let alone surplus populations fleeing cities. And everywhere, violence would escalate. When resources become scarce, when survival is at stake, humans revert to tribalism. We draw lines between us and them. We hoard. We fight. History is full of examples. Every famine, every collapse, every catastrophe produces the same patterns. Initially, cooperation. Then, as resources dwindle, competition, then conflict, then atrocity. The Toba survivors faced this. Small groups competing for dwindling resources. The archaeological record hints at it. Sites abandoned suddenly. Evidence of violence, population movements that suggest displacement rather than migration. We don't have detailed records because the populations were too small, too scattered, and most of them died before they could leave much trace. But the patterns are consistent with resource competition escalating to lethal levels. We would face the same, except we have guns, we have explosives, We have weapons that can kill hundreds, thousands, millions. And we have ideologies that justify using those weapons against whoever we define as the enemy. In a collapse scenario, those weapons would be used extensively, and they would accelerate the population crash beyond anything climate or famine could achieve alone. The trajectory is clear. Catastrophe leads to resource scarcity. Scarcity leads to conflict. Conflict leads to population collapse. And population collapse leads to the loss of knowledge, infrastructure, and the ability to recover. This is what happened after Toba. This is what would happen again. Except this time, there might be no refugia, no coastal populations that can survive on shellfish, no lake communities that maintain ecosystems while everything else dies. Because we have already pushed those ecosystems to their limits. We have overfished the oceans. We have polluted the lakes. We have altered the climate in ways that make even traditional refugia unstable. The southern African coast, where Toba survivors once gathered shellfish for millennia, is now experiencing ocean acidification that is killing shellfish populations. The Great Lakes of East Africa, where other survivors found refuge, are warming and experiencing algal blooms that poison fish populations. The refugia that saved us last time may not exist next time, and even if they do exist, they cannot hold billions of people. They couldn't even hold millions. The carrying capacity of a coastal ecosystem without modern technology is measured in thousands, maybe tens of thousands, not billions. The math doesn't work. The space doesn't exist. And the time required to reduce population from billions to thousands through starvation and conflict would be measured in months of suffering so extreme it defies description. We like to believe we are different from our ancestors, that our technology, our knowledge, our civilization makes us immune to extinction. But Toba shows us that technology is fragile. That knowledge can be lost in a generation. That civilization is a thin veneer over survival instincts that haven't changed in hundreds of thousands of years. The humans who survived Toba were not different from us. They had the same brains, the same capacity for love and violence, the same drive to survive. What they didn't have was the illusion of invulnerability. They knew the world was dangerous. They knew survival was not guaranteed. They lived with that knowledge every day. And when catastrophe came, they endured not because they were prepared, but because they had no choice. We have lost that understanding. We have built a world where catastrophe seems distant, unlikely, someone else's problem. We have insulated ourselves from the reality of our own fragility. And that insulation is dangerous because it prevents us from taking the steps necessary to ensure survival when catastrophe comes. What would those steps look like? True resilience would require decentralization. Communities capable of surviving without global supply chains. Agriculture that doesn't depend on industrial inputs. Energy systems that work locally. Knowledge distributed widely rather than concentrated in specialists. These are not the systems we are building. We are building the opposite. More centralization, more specialization. More dependence on complex systems that fail catastrophically when disrupted. We are optimizing for efficiency, not resilience. And efficiency is the enemy of survival. An efficient system has no redundancy, no backup, no margin for error. When it fails completely. A resilient system is inefficient. It has multiple paths to the same goal, backup systems, margins that seem wasteful until catastrophe hits. And then those margins become the difference between survival and extinction. The Toba survivors survived because human populations were inefficient. They were dispersed, isolated, disconnected. That inefficiency meant the eruption couldn't kill everyone simultaneously. Some groups were far enough away. Some were in the right environments. Some were just lucky. That inefficiency saved the species. Our efficiency means the next catastrophe could kill most of us very quickly. We are all connected, all dependent on the same systems, all vulnerable to the same failures. There is no inefficiency to save us. No isolation to preserve some groups when others fall. We will succeed together or fail together. And right now, we are not building systems designed to succeed under catastrophic pressure. The genetic evidence from Toba tells us something else disturbing. It tells us that survival doesn't require the whole population. It only requires a few. A few thousand people, properly dispersed, can rebuild a species. Not quickly, not easily, but eventually. Which means that From an evolutionary perspective, the death of billions is not an extinction event. It's a bottleneck, tragic for those who die, but survivable for the species. This is a dangerous thought. It suggests that we can afford to lose most of humanity. That collapse is acceptable as long as some remnant survives. But this logic ignores the cost, the knowledge lost, the cultural achievements erased, the suffering of those who die, and it assumes that the remnant will be capable of rebuilding, which is not guaranteed. The Toba survivors took 40,000 years to recover. 40,000 years of living in small groups, struggling to survive, slowly rebuilding population and diversity. Could a post-collapse human remnant do better? Maybe. We have more knowledge now. We understand genetics, agriculture, medicine, engineering. But that knowledge exists in books, in databases, in specialist minds. How much of it would survive a collapse? How much would be accessible without electricity, without infrastructure, without the educational systems that train specialists? Probably very little. The practical knowledge that would matter most, how to grow food, how to purify water, how to make basic tools, is knowledge most people don't have. We have outsourced survival to systems and specialists. Most of us couldn't survive a week without grocery stores. Most of us couldn't grow enough food to feed ourselves. Most of us don't know which plants are edible, how to preserve meat, how to make fire without matches. We are educated, but not in survival. We are skilled, but not in resilience. And in a collapse scenario, most of our education and skills would be useless. A software engineer cannot code without a computer. A financial analyst cannot analyze markets that don't exist. A surgeon cannot perform surgery without sterilized equipment and antibiotics. The expertise that makes modern society function is entirely dependent on that society continuing to function. The knowledge that would matter most is the knowledge we have forgotten. How to live without technology, how to survive in small groups, how to extract resources from the environment directly. Our ancestors knew these things. The Toba survivors knew these things. They had to. It was the price of survival. We have lost that knowledge because we haven't needed it. We assumed we would never need it again. That assumption may be wrong, and if it is wrong, if catastrophe comes and we discover that our technology and our expertise cannot save us, what then? Do we have the capacity to relearn survival skills quickly enough to matter? Do we have the psychological resilience to endure the collapse of everything we consider normal? Do we have the social structures to maintain cooperation when resources become scarce? The Toba survivors did not have a choice. They adapted or died. Most died. The few who adapted did so over generations, not years. They had time, barely, to figure things out. We may not have time. A rapid collapse, the kind triggered by a supervolcano, a nuclear war, or runaway climate feedback loops, happens faster than adaptation. It kills before skills can be learned, before strategies can be tested, before resilience can be built. This is the lesson of Toba that we refuse to learn. Extinction is not a gradual process where populations slowly decline over millennia. It is a sudden event where populations crash in decades. And most of the dying happens in months. And once the crash starts, it is nearly impossible to stop. The survivors of the initial catastrophe face a world stripped of resources, filled with desperate people, and offering no easy paths to recovery. Most of them die too, and the few who eventually survive do so not because they were prepared, but because they were lucky enough to be in one of the vanishingly rare places where survival remained just barely possible. We are not building those places. We are not creating refugia. We are not preparing for the possibility that our systems might fail. We are assuming continuity, assuming that tomorrow will be roughly like today, that next year will be roughly like this year, that the systems we depend on will continue functioning because they always have, but they haven't always. 74,000 years ago, those systems failed. The climate that humans depended on collapsed. The ecosystems that provided food disappeared, and most humans died. The ones who survived did so by accident, by geography, by random chance. There was no plan, no preparation, no system that saved them. Just blind luck and the barest minimum of adaptability. If we face a similar catastrophe, will luck be enough? Will adaptability be enough? Or have we built a civilization so complex, so interconnected, so dependent on functioning systems that collapse becomes total rather than partial? The answer matters because the risks are not hypothetical. They are real, growing, and largely ignored. Climate change is accelerating. Supervolcanoes remain active. Pandemics are becoming more frequent. Nuclear weapons still exist in quantities sufficient to end civilization, and new risks are emerging. Artificial intelligence systems whose behavior we don't fully understand, biological technologies that could create engineered pandemics, geoengineering experiments that could trigger unintended climate cascades. Any of these could be our Toba. Any of these could reduce humanity from billions to thousands in a time span measured in years or decades. And if that happens, the survival of our species will depend not on our technology or our intelligence, but on the same factors that saved our ancestors: geography, luck, and the random chance that some small groups happen to be in places where survival is just barely possible. That is not a comforting thought. It suggests that everything we have built, all our cities, all our knowledge, all our achievements, is fragile. That it could be swept away, not by malice or intention, but by the random catastrophes that planets occasionally experience. That our survival is not assured by our capabilities, but contingent on circumstances beyond our control. The Toba survivors were not heroes. They were not chosen. They were simply the humans who didn't die fast enough, who survived long enough for conditions to improve marginally, who endured decades of hardship and isolation and starvation because the alternative was dying immediately. We are their descendants. We carry their genes. We exist because they refused to die, even when dying would have been easier, even when the world offered no hope, even when every sign pointed to extinction. They survived, barely, by accident, through no special merit or preparation, just through the dumb luck of being in the right place and the stubborn refusal to give up, even when giving up made sense. If catastrophe comes again, will we have that same stubborn refusal, that same capacity to endure when everything is lost? Or have we become so dependent on comfort, so accustomed to stability, that we have lost the ability to survive when survival requires suffering? The question is not whether catastrophe will come. Geologically, ecologically, statistically, it will. The question is whether we will survive it, whether we will be lucky enough, adaptable enough, and stubborn enough to endure what our ancestors endured, whether we will become ancestors ourselves or whether our lineage will join the others that Toba erased. Most lineages ended, most humans died. The ones who survived were not special. They were simply the ones who hadn't died yet when conditions improved enough for recovery to begin. If extinction comes again, some of us might survive, not because we deserve to, not because we earned it, but because extinction might fail to finish the job. Again. Barely. One more time. That is not a plan. It is not preparation. It is not resilience. It is hope that blind chance will roll in our favor again, the way it did 74,000 years ago. And hope is not a strategy. It is what you cling to when you have nothing else. 74,000 years ago, humanity had nothing else. And we survived, barely, by accident, because extinction failed to complete its work. Next time, it might not fail. Next time, there might be no refugia, no coastal populations surviving on shellfish, no lake communities enduring while continents die, no lucky remnant that happens to be in the right place when catastrophe strikes. Just collapse, complete, final. The end of a species that almost ended before and survived only through random chance. We tell ourselves that can't happen, that we are too numerous, too widespread, too advanced. That extinction is for other species, not for us. But Toba says otherwise. Toba says we were almost extinct once, that we survived not through superiority, but through luck, that our existence is contingent, not guaranteed, that everything we are, everything we have built, everything we might become, depends on catastrophe not happening, or happening in a way that leaves survivors. Most catastrophes don't leave survivors. Most extinction events are total. But the one that almost killed us left just enough humans alive that recovery became possible, barely, over tens of thousands of years, after uncountable suffering and loss. If we are lucky, if catastrophe comes again, maybe it will leave survivors again. Maybe some remnant will endure. Maybe in 40,000 years, Their descendants will build another civilization and wonder about us the way we wonder about the Toba survivors. Or maybe not. Maybe next time, extinction will finish what it started, and the universe will continue, indifferent, unaware that a species that once looked up at the stars and wondered why it existed has stopped existing, stopped wondering, stopped everything. We exist because extinction failed. If you remember nothing else from this, remember that. We are not here because we earned it. We are here because 74,000 years ago, catastrophe tried to erase us and didn't quite succeed. It came close, closer than we like to admit, close enough that we can still see the evidence in our DNA, close enough that every human alive is part of the same narrow lineage, the same unlikely survivors, the same accidental future. That future continues. For now. But there is no guarantee it will continue forever. No promise that survival is permanent. No assurance that the next catastrophe will leave survivors. Only the knowledge that it almost didn't last time. And the question of whether almost is enough. Whether luck runs out. Whether the next extinction attempt succeeds where the last one failed. We don't know. We can't know. But we can look back at 74,000 years ago and understand that survival is fragile. That humanity is fragile, that existence is not guaranteed but granted, temporarily, contingently, by circumstances beyond our control. The ash fell for years, the sun disappeared, the world died, and a few thousand humans survived, not because they were special, but because extinction ran out of time before it ran out of humans. Next time, it might not run out of time. What do you think would have happened if just one more group had failed? If the margin had been slightly narrower? If luck had rolled just a bit differently? Would we exist at all? Or would humanity be a footnote in geological records, a failed species that almost made it but didn't quite survive the Toba eruption? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this is not just history, this is a warning, and warnings only matter if we pay attention.